My name is Vesa Sirén. I'm a Finnish music journalist, a researcher on Sibelius, and the editor of Sibelius.fi that is available in Finnish, Swedish, German, and English. And we are here to interview Sir Simon Rattle, who is starting a very interesting Sibelius project. You are going to conduct once again all the symphonies of Sibelius in Berlin and in London with a violin concerto with Leonidas Kavakos. Why did you choose to return to these symphonies?
Well, of course, I come from England, which, if you don't know, is actually West Finland. Mm-hmm. And it's a country where, of course, Sibelius is absolutely at the centre of our concert life. My work in Birmingham, we did the symphonies an enormous amount, but it's music we all grew up with. In Germany, as you know, it's something very different. And despite Karajan's very persuasive advocacy, this has always been difficult music for German musicians and the German public. And I was stunned to find, for instance, that in 2010 it was the first Sibelius cycle the orchestra had ever played. Indeed, the first time they'd ever played the Third Symphony in a concert. That's really a surprise, but it's part of the strange history between Sibelius and Austria and Germany.
Yes. What are your earliest memories of the music of Jean Sibelius? Was there a moment of revelation for you?
Well, I think they were some of the earliest recordings that I bought. But in Liverpool, where I grew up, they were played all the time because I was a percussionist, and so as a timpanist particularly, Sibelius writes the most extraordinary and strangest timpani parts of almost any composer. I mean, they're a very particular part of all of his texture. They're very often the pendulum on which pieces go. So, I mean, I remember as a child going to the Liverpool Phil and hearing these pieces. My first experience hearing the Fifth Symphony live, I must have been 10 or 11, was a complete thunderbolt. Mm-hmm. To me, in fact, it was the piece I made my debut with the Liverpool Philharmonic 8 or 9 years later.
Of course, one of your early breakthroughs was John Player conducting competition where Paavo Björklund, or Berglund as we say in Nordic countries, was in the jury, and he took you to Bournemouth and he recorded, of course, Sibelius symphonies with them for EMI. And I remember that he gave you some instructions how to do it in Finnish style.
Well, I mean, I think everything about Paavo was in Finnish style. When he was finished and he was gone. Mm-hmm. But when he was generous, he was incredibly generous. Of course, I was 19, and so I sat in all his rehearsals. And it's interesting, in this time his Sibelius was almost the only thing he rehearsed. Mm-hmm. And he rehearsed it to the point beyond which a British orchestra could believe. But then, if you listen to the recordings, you can actually tell what he did. And in the Birmingham time, when I invited him there, he had one long visit, and when he left, I got just a little note from him saying, "Oh, I looked at your Sibelius scores in the library. Take another look at them." And in all of these scores, he'd written in various states of inebriation, all kinds of instructions, but incredibly valuable things. Basically, every trick of the trade that he could remember. From start this transition earlier, make the accelerando here, to use this open string on the violins here, try this reorchestration. You can never hear this, change this. Absolute. It was as though he thought, now how can I most help? And characteristically done, kind of just quietly in the corner. because anyone who'd lived with Paavo could not help but be deeply impacted by his performances. I still have all his bowings and fingerings, which are very eccentric and very special, and of course work magnificently.
In 1990s, I asked you, did you use these alterations? And you said that, are you crazy? I used them all. Will it be that way next year with this cycle?
Most of the, they're very tiny alterations. And actually, the only place where you have to help the orchestration at all is in the First Symphony. That really makes sense. I mean, he was incredibly optimistic about, for instance, how loud a double bass could be in terms of the rest of the orchestra. But otherwise, no, you don't have to. But in something like the Seventh Symphony, the way in which Paavo used the strings either dividing or not dividing, who did what, who played what, is of incredible use. And this is just the conductor's secret art. I mean, it makes it sound like Harry Potter, but it really isn't. It's to do with the hard work of making a piece sound. And I think Sibelius had a very, very clear idea what he wanted to be heard, but not always exactly how to make that work. That's not everybody is Elgar. Elgar's works sound immediately. It's more the Bruckner problem, and sometimes the textures have the feel of Bruckner, and you have to elucidate them.
Sibelius had a conducting career in Germany, but that didn't develop so much than it did in England. But he did conduct En Saga with Berlin Philharmonic, and there was also Georg Schneefocht, a Finnish conductor who conducted Berlin Philharmonic quite often. And if you listen to the early recordings of, say, Wilhelm Furtwängler and the Violin Concerto, the Finale, for example, the phrasing is very different of what you hear today.
Yeah.
How does that world of Furtwängler and other early conductors of Sibelius affect your interpretations?
Let's say we tend to listen to other people.
Okay.
In that, I mean, it's always fascinating. It's always fascinating to hear, and it can be, as with Kusevitsky's famous performance of the Seventh, it can be that it sounds not very like Sibelius and still be staggeringly compelling. And it was quite interesting to hear something so almost hysterically Russian, but in a piece like that, which can work.
Then, of course, as you mentioned, Karajan was a great advocate of Sibelius, and he did extremely dry recordings with Philharmonia, and then very different recordings with Berlin Philharmonic. And Glenn Gould liked them both, and he said that Sibelius, one of the recordings was one of his Desert Island discs, if I'm not mistaken. What would be your Desert Island discs of Sibelius discography?
I wonder, I mean, probably not Karajan's, although in terms of actual sound, as always, I mean, he had a staggering imagination for the colour of the sound. And so a piece like the Fourth Symphony which was, I know because I talked to him about it, was always very, always very, very close to him. What was never interesting for him was the rhythm at all. And I remember when I first came to do the Fifth, and the famous thing at the beginning where the strings play a 16th note before the winds. I actually had to show the full score to the string section for them even to believe it. I said, "Oh no, we've played this for years. We always play this together. You must be wrong."
Amazing. After Karajan, there have been conductors that have conducted Sibelius in Berlin and in Vienna with great results. Young Lorin Maazel was one of them, I think.
And Bernstein's performance of the first with Vienna is, I mean, for me, completely astonishing. I wouldn't do it anything like that, but absolutely astonishing.
Now, Sibelius once said that I like Germans, Germans like not Sibelius. He said it in his even clumsier English, and that have been true sometimes. Then again, for example, Richard Strauss said that ich kann mehr, aber ist größer. I can do more than he can, but he is greater. And well,
look, there was a time where the music world wasn't so polarized. When I did a concert recently for the anniversary of the First World War with the Berlin Philharmoniker and the London Symphony together, I had to remind both groups that actually Nickisch had been the principal conductor of both orchestras simultaneously. And when we played a piece by George Butterworth, who was killed in the First World War, in fact it was Nickisch who'd given the first performance. Similarly, Sibelius was very accepted in the first part of the 20th century, also in Germany. There was a point where it became more polemical, shall we say. And it's, of course, Sibelius, like Berlioz, is absolutely, he's not in this big line of what would be considered in Austria and Germany the way to compose. And particularly at a time where there was enormous weight placed upon originality of invention and harmony. This wasn't going to be Sibelius. I think he was happy to leave, for instance, harmony where he found it. And he said himself, not everybody can be an innovating genius. You know, you have your own small place as an apparition from the forest, which is a very, very interesting phrase, because for me, in many ways, it's one of the most staggeringly original composers that there is. But it's a different line. And look, we've seen it, just as Pierre Boulez for so many years said, well, no, there is one line where music can go. Any composer who does not accept the necessity to compose 12-tone music must simply be rejected. It's a normal thing, but it's very tedious. And thank God there are people who take another journey. And this particular journey that Sibelius took through the forest is very, very unusual. And it's still hard because you see people trying to make him into something else. And of course you can see the debt to romantic composers, particularly in the first two symphonies. But then after that it becomes more and more his own world, and it's not quite like anything else. I would say white heat rather than red heat.
I don't think that Theodor Adorno and the others realized really that Fourth Symphony was modern and radical in 1911, and the way he put together Seventh Symphony was very original in 1920s. So what they were saying that...
And it's still original now. I mean, almost nobody has played with time and tempo.
Absolutely.
In the way that Sibelius did. This idea of permanent motion. I mean, and a cellarando that never stops until which can go from slow to fast and suddenly turns into slow again. I mean, then you have to go to Indonesian music to get anything which is at all similar.
Of course, one of the contradictions was between Mahler and Sibelius, but it's not as big contradiction as some imagine. But of course, Sibelius talked to Mahler about the profound logic of symphonies. And Mahler said that nein, Symphonie muss wie ein Welt sein. Es muss alles umfassen. That it should be like the world and have everything in it. I don't think it's that black and white, but what are your
Of course
thoughts?
it isn't. I mean, the sad thing is that surely Sibelius had heard a certain amount of Mahler, but I think at this moment Mahler had heard really almost no Sibelius, maybe the Valse Triste. And I think
and Spring Song. And,
I think if Mahler had lived longer, he would have been very fascinated where Sibelius went. Except, I mean, look, there's two differences. One is, Mahler is of course a maximalist. He's like a red giant, the kind of star which would take in all of the planets up to Jupiter. Sibelius is of course the white dwarf, the tiny star the size of our moon, but where everything is of an incredible weight. And he was a composer who concentrated upon himself until he reached Tapiola. And it's hard to imagine any music being actually more concentrated than that. And I always suspected that this was part of his problem, is that he'd reached a point of concentration where he couldn't go any further without it kind of exploding or imploding on itself. The other thing is, for two composers who are very concerned with nature, is Mahler is always concerned with the person in nature, and particularly himself in nature. Whereas in Sibelius's, certainly in the symphonies, you very rarely feel that there are people there. It is nature itself. Though this extraordinary, moving thing that he said when he saw the swans circling while he was writing the Fifth Symphony, and saying, look, why is it that this sight, the swans, the wild geese, the cranes, why does this move me more than anything in art or literature or music? This is another thing. He says he's an apparition from the forest, but he is of the forest. And where humans appear, maybe it's the forest of fear. It's his own forest. When you go out there and you think you may never return. I think that is so deeply at the heart of his music.
Forest of Fear, that is something that you can hear from the First Symphony to Tapiola. Actually,
absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely. That you go, and it's extraordinary because particularly in the First Symphony, he presents you things that you believe you recognize, and as things do in the twilight, they turn into something else, and they turn into something often very, very terrifying.
Yeah. Already the transformation process of Sibelius that is so unique is present in the First Symphony. Can you tell us a little bit more about your thoughts on First Symphony? Of course, he was quite experienced already, having written Kullervo and Lemminkäinen and many other masterpieces.
I love the First Symphony, I always did. But if I look at it really objectively, it's the first movement that I find the most characteristic and the most incredibly strong, in the way that he starts this kind of circular motion, which seems to be so typical of his pieces, and the type of rhythms which are just always slightly off kilter. So you have no idea where they are, but must still be performed tremendously accurately. I'd always thought that people sometimes make a mistake with Sibelius in thinking of the rhythms impressionistically, and I must be very influenced by Paavo in this, but this feeling that also it's a mosaic that you need to put together so that it blurs, and there's an accuracy in how he makes things blur, like Seurat painting, that it could be many dots which actually create a type of shimmer. And this you see very strongly in the First Symphony.
Yes, of course he talked about God throwing the pieces of mosaic down to him, and he must see what kind of combination God was looking for, and that will be the symphony.
Oh God, yeah. The grandiose part of composers, don't we love them?
No.
Yeah, no, so he seemed to oscillate between grandiosity and total lack of self-confidence with nothing much in between. But there we go. It's another story.
That is very Sibelian thing, if you look at his diaries. Then again, he was even more precise than later with his dynamic markings. And some of the things you hear in the early Kajanus recording of the first, and you don't hear it very often after that with Johan Paava and with some others, yes. And that's also true with number 2. For example, the Cornos, the first answer that they give, it's full of detailed writing.
Well, rhythmically, it's very hard. I mean, with the Second Symphony, I always also had the feeling that it was always. I mean, the idea. Sometimes people present you with a watch, and then they take the watch to pieces, and you see what's inside. It was only Sibelius who presents you with the pieces of the watch, one after another. Say, okay, now try and make sense of what I'm doing. Yeah. And then suddenly, miraculously, he seems to put it together. And you think, oh my God, I think I saw a watch. And then at that point, it's gone again, and it's fallen into pieces. But it seems very important to me that the pieces are very clear. And that particularly if you come from the First Symphony with these type of pathétique melodies, if you treat the Second Symphony like this, you're already in trouble. The melodies seem to me to need a great deal of tensile strength, a lot of steel within them.
Second Symphony, for early Finnish conductors and critics, they thought it is very obvious that the significance is in Finnish patriotism, that this is a song of struggle against Russia that tried to rationalize Finnish Grand Duchy and so on.
What do you think? What do you think as a Finn?
I think that's part of the story, and Sibelius was very precise in saying that that's not the whole story. Of course, his heart is patriotic, but that doesn't mean that there is only one interpretation.
But it can look in our own time. I mean, I knew Lutosławski very well, and he would say to me, "Simon, I promise you that the Third Symphony is not to do with the political events in Poland at all." And as a person outside, I could say, "But Witold, I can promise you that it sounds like it, whether you like it or not. That it has this feeling, and there is no way for a composer to escape that." And I think Witold protested too much, and I think also maybe Sibelius was very loath to become any more of a national hero than he was. Because often we think, wouldn't it be wonderful if composers were treated wonderfully and looked after and given what they need? And Sibelius is quite a good argument against that. He got his pension very early, and it didn't always help. It's hard to know what made it so difficult for him to compose, whether it was the ease that he had in his life, or whether it was just simply the weight of expectations past when it's certainly later in life.
Yes, it was easy to him until he became 50 or so. Before that, there was no problem meeting deadlines and so on.
No.
But of course, the music got more complex and it needed time to mature. And for example, when we go to the Third Symphony, that's for many people is the first puzzle that they can understand the national romanticism of First and maybe Second Symphony, but Third Symphony is something totally different.
I mean, what's extraordinary is, although you can see a metamorphosis happening particularly during the second, what is to me, almost unprecedented is the change of tone of the Third Symphony, that it is suddenly so classical. Mm-hmm. And it always makes me think that actually that's what he was all along, and that the first two symphonies were something that he also needed to do, as young Szymanowski did. The Third Symphony is so concentrated and so original, and in many ways very, very strange, particularly the finale, which is the point where he really becomes an apparition from the forest. In the finale, particularly the beginning, you have no idea where everything is coming from, and that it could coalesce into this extraordinary march that, like Paavo, when he'd finished his sentence, simply stops and walks away. There's no symphony quite like that has built up such a head of steam and then just stops, because it simply wouldn't be proper or necessary to say anything more.
Very interesting detail is that it is not only classical, it goes back to some of the melodies Sibelius heard from Kalevala style Runo singers. I must give this example.
Oh, do.
You know the of course we all remember how Third Symphony begins.
Yeah.
And if you listen to this, it's similar in some ways. You don't
there's a similar obsessive return to the same type of intervals.
And it's C major, or is it really? And that's the thing that you might want to ask yourself when you listen to the beginning of Third Symphony, that it is one of the most extraordinary C majors, and that is of course apparent in the last bar of Seventh Symphony also. He makes C major sound like no one else.
Well, this is, surely the most miserable C major that has ever existed.
But before that we have Fourth Symphony, which was my moment of revelation when I was a teenager. For me, the first bars told me that, okay, now I'm at home, this is for me. But how was it for you when you first heard that symphony?
Well, I must have heard it later than the others, near the end of my teens. And of course by this time I not only knew Pelléas and Melisande, but I also knew Parsifal. And it seemed to me that this was, particularly the first movement, was as though Parsifal had been put into a small truck and crushed. As though actually everything that Parsifal does in 5 hours is done in 9 minutes in the first movement of the Fourth Symphony. And everything you need to know is there, absolutely crushed together to the greatest concentration. And everything that Debussy's harmony had started to do is put in a little tiny nutshell in the second movement. Everything that the Mahler Ninth was doing in terms of 1 or 2 lines put together in intense loneliness is kind of encapsulated in the third movement. And it's still, I remember hearing performances also where the orchestras were just so puzzled that there was no way to get through it. Of course, everybody could play the notes in the right place, but as ever with Sibelius, what's interesting is the silence and how the tension goes through the silence. And when this is, as the music goes on and on, one feels, in fact, you feel him collapsing on silence in the Sixth Symphony. But in the Fourth Symphony, you feel that the silences are a journey that have to be gone through. But on the other hand, I remember in my early 20s having my first meeting with Esa-Pekka, who then was not particularly European. And when he didn't have anything to say, he just sat there. And I remember thinking back on that, yes, no, also these silences are a journey that one has to go through. If you're not Finnish, sometimes that's hard to... You're looking at, well, of course, you don't say anything if you don't have anything to say, but it's a special thing in your country. And so, frankly, it was Paavo's performances of the Fourth that really made me understand, okay, this is what this is. And also, I mean, his absolute fury of what the moment was, while at the same time being absolutely not willing to exaggerate anything. It's the intensity, the enormous intensity of those moments which then stop.
You know, there's an exhibition opening this week in Atheneum, Finnish National Gallery, Sibelius and the World of Art. And you can listen to the Fourth Symphony and see the paintings of Colli at the same time. And for me, yes, it is wonderful, and then not. Of course, he visited Colli, the famous Finnish mountain. It's not really a mountain, and got some impressions that might have inspired him to write some notes. But when you listen to the Fourth Symphony, it's not a mountain symphony. It's nothing as ridiculous as that. Sorry, Richard Strauss. But I think that you talked about the essence of the symphony. That it's not a nature painting. It's something much more and something much deeper.
But also, if you look at the slow movements, the way in which this melody is struggling to be born.
Yes.
And by the time it is finally born in its entirety, having added one or two notes every time, once it's got there, it collapses upon itself. And this is also so Sibelius, that the struggle was so great that it can't be born.
Yes, and the dynamic markings show that very, very clearly. And many conductors actually want to do a little bit more crescendo to have some kind of fulfillment, and that is all wrong, of course. But we are lucky to have many of you that do it precisely like he.
Well, we try, but you absolutely don't need to Photoshop Sibelius. He is what he is.
Then again, he struggled for years with Fifth Symphony, and the way he combined the first two movements is stroke of genius, but he had to work hard to get there. What are your...
But you've seen Beethoven's sketches.
Absolutely.
Yes. I mean, some composers, they just produce it. I'm sure Strauss could have written most of his music while he was having a bath or playing cards. Doesn't make it any the less great. Some composers struggle and struggle and struggle. And you can tell particularly with the later Sibelius. Also, look, it happens all the time with writer friends. They get better and better, and part of what happens when they get better is they get more self-critical. So nothing will do anymore. And this also must have been Sibelius's problem. But nobody would naturally come up with the type of motion that he finally came up with in the Fifth Symphony. You feel, I mean, he was already wonderful at transitions between tempos. I mean, you can see that even in the finale of the First Symphony, how he gets from the opening tempo to the fast. But this is simply something else, that you suddenly find yourself flying in the air, having thought you were on the ground, and one simply just doesn't know how it happens. Although if you rehearse it enough times, it's very hard. You find out how it happens. And I remember when I first went to Bali, this is the first time in my life I actually heard an accelerando, which I thought was like Sibelius. After spending a couple of weeks in Ubud, I talked to the players and I said, well, how is it that you all get faster together and suddenly you reach a plateau and it stops? And they looked at me with this kind of pity in their faces. They said, you've been 2 weeks here already and you don't realise that the young girl who dances conducts? I said, well, what do you mean? They said, oh, just look at her next time. They have a motion, the hand goes up and their hand moves. And as their hand moves, we get faster. And when her hand stops, we stop getting faster. So absolutely, it's to do with these, basically, you reach the age of 11, you're too old to do it. But they show the accelerando. The dancer does not follow the musicians. It's the other way around. The dancer conducts the musicians. And in our Western culture, normally accelerando was a matter of step, take a step up. And Sibelius, for the first time, is the person who actually made it absolutely a motion. I mean, it should be running down a hill, but in fact, it's running faster up a hill. It's the opposite of gravity. And to get musicians to do this is very hard. I would try to explain this to the Balinese people. Say, oh, so in your country you don't have good musicians? I said, well, actually we do, but they can't do that.
Are there any special demands with the Berlin Philharmonic when you do, for example, that accelerando in the first movement of Fifth Symphony?
Well, yeah, to do an accelerando at all in the Berlin Philharmonic is really quite a hard thing.
Okay.
Because it's a very heavy truck. It's a very Germanic truck and it has its feet on the ground. And part of what's extraordinary is that the sound comes out of the ground. And often Sibelius, like Debussy said, it demands an orchestra without feet. That actually you have to really move. And it's not that we can't rush, because we can rush like hell, particularly when we don't want to. But when it's actually necessary to get faster in a controlled way, it's very difficult, because it requires the same kind of trust that you have if you stand up and someone says, yes, I'll catch you when you fall. You can't say, to actually do this accelerando and know that it won't go off the rails or simply drive off the tracks requires an incredible amount of trust and habit, and it's very hard. Interesting, I would say, fascinatingly, it's the Fifth Symphony that this orchestra found the hardest by far. The symphonies that I found tremendously difficult with other orchestras, number 4 and number 6, were absolutely no problem here at all. People could, also because there's such a feeling of sound and line, and also they know how to go through silences and how to fill silences with meaning. The Fifth was always the hardest thing, and so I look forward to working incredibly hard again and having enough time to work incredibly hard. Okay.
Number 6, some conductors say that this is actually practically written, that it plays itself, but does it really?
No Sibelius plays itself. It depends what it depends what you want to achieve. To get to level 1 is easy. To get beyond that, it's harder. It's also to do with understanding. You need to understand Schoenberg and Palestrina to have the feeling, and also because it's probably Finnish conductors who say it plays itself, because for an outsider to get into this, it can appear quite opaque. Also because it's very much in the middle dynamic in all kinds of ways. It's only when it only becomes truly terrifying when the last movement spirals out of control. And before Tapiola, it's some of the most violent music he ever wrote. But the fact also that it says what it's going to say, and you have an apparition, and it stops.
Yeah.
I think aesthetically, particularly for mid-Europeans, it's the hardest. Yeah. And actually, Pavo's theory, and of course we know that he was writing the 6th and 7th Symphony at the same time. Yeah. And the fact that they really do share material, this idea that they are to do with each other is, I think he's right. I think they're as much, these two together are as much a symphony as, in a way, the last 3 Mozart symphonies are some kind of meta symphony. They do belong together. And I would find it hard to imagine now playing the 6th without the 7th.
Okay.
This is what I've always done in the last years, and played them without a gap. And this seems to do something wonderful to both pieces, and it's as though they breathe together as an organism.
Mm-hmm. Sibelius once said that 6th Symphony reminds him of the smell of the first snow. And it doesn't really smell, but
but it's exactly the kind of dichotomy you would say. Yeah.
Yeah.
If snow had a smell, it would sound like, well, so many things.
Yeah.
So many things, and it's the piece I was most helped by going to his house.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
For this piece.
Ainola.
Not so much the house as the surround. I mean, the house is extraordinary and oppressive. How it's like its own kind of prison. But the area, the area around it. When I saw that, I understood the 6th much better. It's just, the minute you see the beach on Aldborough, and you can see why Britain wrote Peter Grimes. There are certain places that show you, and something that the contrast between light and sudden darkness, and the way in which there are many different watercolors, many different colors of snow, many different whites. Mm-hmm. That made sense to me after. It's funny, and it's for all of us, because we had this experience in Birmingham of going to Helsinki and playing the last 3 symphonies, which is, when I think of it, possibly the definition of arrogance. But we did it, and at the lunchtime we did a dress rehearsal, and at lunchtime the whole orchestra went to the house. Mm-hmm. And we walked around. We had a couple of hours, and then we came back in the evening and played very differently. Without ever being able to put our fingers on, well, why was this different?
Do you remember that in the forest near Ainola, there is actually a place that Sibelius, who was not very religious in your ordinary sense of the word, called Temple. He liked to rest there, and he called that place in the forest his temple. And yes. So in 6th Symphony, you smell the smell of you can see the first snow and the most violent music there is.
But I see no people in that. Whereas almost for the first time in the 7th Symphony, I see a man surrounded by these processes that are happening in the 7th Symphony, trying to make sense of it. Mm-hmm. That's the point where I feel him.
So how would you describe these processes? And for the last 2 bars where you reach the sea, but is it really a victory?
I think, you push it up there. There's a mixture of so many myths, and the bird eats your liver once again. I think it is the most enormous effort to get there. I mean, these last bars are some of the saddest and most honest bars I know. Because I grew up with Ormandy's recording, who added a trumpet to the end. A trumpet at the end, and of course made the timpani crescendo. This idea that if only Sibelius had been a little more clever, that he could have been a great film composer, is a shame, because actually Ormandy in many ways was a fantastic Sibelius conductor. But the end says a very specific thing, which is it just reaches this point and then it's done. And you have no idea what comes after. Yeah. It stops, and then there is a silence. And then what is that silence? And that, for me, the idea that you could make C major be despairing is, again, one of the most original ideas you could have. I mean, Schoenberg at the end of his life said, there is plenty of good music still to be written in C major. Yes, but I don't think he could have imagined that C major.
Mm-hmm. Now, after that, of course, comes Tapiola, but this is not part of the cycle this time.
No, sadly. I mean, I wish there was a way. I mean, Tapiola it's such a special piece that I almost don't understand how to program it. Mm-hmm. It kills everything around it. It has such a density. It almost needs to be in a concert on its own. Then you need to walk out into the forest and experience it. In some ways, you should hear it after the Seventh Symphony, because in some ways it is the Eighth Symphony.
Mm-hmm. Eighth Symphony, of course, he struggled for decades with Eighth Symphony, and I arranged a world premiere of 3 sketches with Helsinki Philharmonic after discussing the sketches with Dr. Timo Virtanen, who is the editor of Sibelius edition, and he had picked these up as the 3 most likely contenders.
And where were they?
They were in Finnish National Library. Yeah. Sibelius family gave enormous amount of sketches and manuscripts for that library, and there's so much work to be done still with those sketches. Some people say that you can actually put together a symphony out of those sketches. I don't agree, but I agree that these orchestrated sketches probably at some part of the process were parts of Eighth Symphony, and the first sketch might have been the idea of the beginning at some part of the process. Of course, then comes these famous marks, and he moves the flutes up, and he makes some alterations, and then he has continued, but where and how, we don't know.
But presumably this was all burnt, this famous bonfire.
Presumably, yes. Then again, after the burning, he said that he has it ready in sketches, but those sketches have not appeared.
But what's interesting is that his wife said that gradually his mood lightened after the burning.
Yes.
And I have the feeling that the weight of expectations and this war somehow between the British and the Americans, feeling this was the greatest symphony since Beethoven, and René Leibowitz saying, is this the worst composer who ever existed? And also maybe, because when I read what he says about these larger pieces, there seems that there might have been also a choral piece among the things he burnt. That the idea that he, not only that he might write a larger piece, but that it was expected. That then you would do the 8th and 9th symphony, you would do the 9th symphony as every composer tried to. Maybe the idea that something had to be of that size was no longer possible, and maybe his music needed to concentrate more and more and more. Or maybe after the First World War Elgar wrote, I mean, this supreme masterpiece, the cello concerto, in memory of his wife, full of the ghosts of Tristan, and was simply not able to write anything of any significance again after it. And maybe also as the world changed, it was not possible for him to find his place in it. Or maybe his language had developed to such a point where it was too concentrated to be expressed.
Then again, there is some new approach to harmony in the first sketch and in some very late Sibelius. Yes. So he was approaching a new, not to say style, but he was dealing with new kind of ideas.
This extraordinary interlude in The Tempest, which is one of the most dissonant pieces of music that exists.
Yes.
I mean, he was open to this, but it was how to. For somebody who was such a master of form and who reinvented form every time he wrote a piece, how much of that was possible? And this is why people tend to forget what an innovator he was in that way.
Actually, I once talked to a grandson of Jean Sibelius, Mr. Erkki Virkkunen, and he actually drove to Ainola on the day of the burning. Oh. And it was very interesting that Aino Sibelius was obviously shocked. And she said that there was a great burning today. And Erkki goes to his grandpa and Sibelius answers, well, I just burned some old stuff. And he was like, it was not just such a big deal. And already then there was a kind of feeling that, and I feel better now.
Yes.
Then you are also doing violin concerto, and not the first version, but the final version. It's Sibelius at one of his peaks. What are your thoughts of the concerto that is so popular and so often played?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, of course, it is still a hard thing here. It's still hard for people to understand here, which is why I don't dare to do the first version, because actually even though the popular version is strange enough here, I love it, and you can see somehow where the Third Symphony fits in with this, particularly in the last two movements. And I think the second movement is one of the most extraordinary utterances there is. I played it many times with Ida Handel, who I loved to work with, and she played it so slowly. I did not do the traditional speedings up. She said, no, this should really hurt. And if it can really hurt, that says something very, very important. It also has this idea of short melodies that could have an incredible fierceness, and sometimes almost be torn off as though the flames had licked the edges and you don't know what's after them. That really starts in there.
Then again, the finale, he moved away ma non troppo. He wanted to be allegro, and I guess he would have hated it to be called Polonaise for Polar Bears, because I think his idea was that it is much more demonic than Polonaise for Polar Bears. What are your thoughts of the finale?
Look, it's similar problem as the Schumann violin concerto finale. That yes, but it shouldn't be taken so fast that it's actually not playable, because it has to be also articulate. And what's absolutely fascinating, and this is something he was also playing with in the Third Symphony, is this idea: is it in 3 in the bar or is it in 2 in the bar? And you never quite know where you are. And I must say, I end up conducting as much of it as possible in 2, so you have this rhythm against the rather so that you're always slightly out of balance.
And maybe to wrap things up, it is interesting that when Mahler asked Sibelius, well, what would you like me to conduct of your own music? And Sibelius politely said, nichts, nothing. Not to be rude, but he didn't want to be seen as a composer who is asking for favors. No. But Mahler didn't agree with that. Before he died, he actually programmed Sibelius's violin concerto in New York, but he died before he conducted it. So he probably knew the score, and he probably approved very much.
Look, what's interesting is, of course, what Mahler played in his last years anyway. I mean, to find so much Debussy and Elgar and Busoni, for instance. But we know, for instance, that Elgar's Second Symphony was on the program for 1912.
Yes.
And presumably this was the same time the violin concerto was.
Yes.
And I would have bet you he would have conducted the Fourth Symphony, and that it would have been extraordinary, because this was a man with incredibly open mind, Mahler.
Now, what are the major changes of your approach to Sibelius if we think of first the cycle in Birmingham with the famous recordings, and then the cycle in 2010? How much has changed, and what are the major changes?
I'm probably not a good person to ask.
Okay.
I think only the listeners can. I think as a conductor, if you think, oh yeah, no, I really want to change what I did before, this is a mistake. I think of it more as if you're on a ship and you start moving, and you actually you have no idea, oh my God, is the land moving or is the ship moving? But then suddenly you're not at that land anymore. And this is something with time. I hope there are new insights, but I'm the last person to know. I can only speak what I feel. It's a fascinating thing for me to work with an orchestra which has such a possibility of different sounds, and such an ability, and such a possibility of sostenuto. It's a very hard thing to work with an orchestra who doesn't immediately love the music as I do, although gradually over the last performances and in 2010 I found people saying, no, but actually this is not our music, but it's great music. And I hope this time they'll say, maybe this is our music. All performances are works in progress, and this will be as much as anything
there should be a list of all the Furtwängler concerts with Sibelius with Berlin Philharmoniker and Herbert von Karajan concerts, and then it should be very natural that the Sibelius is their music, the music of Berlin Philharmonic Orchestra.
But it's interesting. It is interesting in this culture what takes and what doesn't take. How the orchestra themselves would say, I've said Schumann has been, for instance, a hard composer for them to play, because it evinces a kind of impatience and a fluttering, which is not naturally part of the orchestra's personality. I mean, the orchestra's personality has Brahms at the base. And so, for instance, the struggle to play Schumann not like Brahms is absolutely part of our everyday work. And so what's important is you don't play Sibelius like anything else other than Sibelius. That's always going to be a work in progress.
Does the sound world of, well, of course, Sibelius, when he was very young and in Vienna studying, he said that Bruckner is naive but the greatest composer alive. And
well, there are many similarities, and it was no surprise that Pavo was such a wonderful Bruckner conductor. There's sometimes the simplest things are the hardest, and the simplest things that Sibelius and Bruckner were saying, the absolutely straightforward things, are where they join hands. Now, the foundation that doesn't bend.
Do you see any composers alive today? Many people say that they are inspired by Sibelius, from Thomas Adis to Tristan Murail and so on. Do you hear the legacy of Sibelius in modern music?
You know, when I played Lindbergh's Aura, yes.
Yes.
Mostly not. But every now and then, certainly everybody has taken it and studied it, and he gave people an incredible type of freedom. But it's like expecting there'll be a school of Janacek. These were very, very individual composers. And you know, apart from Vaughan Williams and Walton, for instance, they admired it enormously and they nodded their hat. But somebody who actually follows that path, no, I think I think they would be lost in the forest of fear.
My last question is that it has been a too long time since you conducted in Finland. You really must come with Berlin Phil or to conduct some Finnish orchestras. Is there even a distant possibility that this will happen in the coming years?
I would love it. It's so wonderful to play there, and our last experience, was it 2 years ago, was just an enormous pleasure.
Yeah.
Let's hope.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much.